C.S. Lewis, scholar, teacher, and writer, has been called one of the most influential spokesmen for the Christian faith during the 20th century. While teaching at Oxford University, his books and radio talks brought him to international prominence. Now more than 40 years after his death, his books, including the Screwtape Letters, Mere Christianity, and the Chronicles of Narnia, remain popular bestsellers. On this program, we trace the depth of spirit and the breadth of mind that led to his worldwide influence. Join us for The Widening Circle, the life of C.S. Lewis, on this day of discovery.
Oxford, the city of dreaming spires. For more than 800 years, a place of great wisdom and learning. It was here that C.S. Lewis came as a student, a wounded veteran of World War I, convinced that God did not exist and determined to become a great poet. It was here a few years later that Lewis, the university teacher, moved from atheism to embrace a personal faith in God that altered the course of his life.
And something obviously did really happen to him in 1931. He was a different man afterwards. And it seems to me that the only way you can account for that change is by some real intervention, some divine intervention, some spiritual power being infused into him or getting hold of him and shaking him by the scruff of the neck and turning him around. And books just poured from his pen. He was incredibly prodigious in his output.
There are certain Christian authors who one feels that they were great, very good writers or artists until they became Christians, and then somehow it seems to have almost sapped it, almost as if it took their energies elsewhere. But there are others, and he's one supremely, who are enabled, whose gifts are released. I think that's perhaps why his poetry didn't work earlier. But I think that his creative writing came out of the very integration when he crossed the divide. I think it liberated something within him. And that growing sense of forgiveness, which was to come later, and the way his imagination is released.
Lewis is remembered primarily for his books, but his job was teaching English language and literature. Each day at Magdalen College, he followed a predictable but demanding routine.
He would get up at 7, have a cup of tea. His scout would bring him the tea. He would get ready and go off to chapel at 8:25. He would have a few paces in Addison's Walk, this beautiful walk that goes along Magdalen College, and then come back and tackle his correspondence for about an hour and a half or 2 hours. And then his first pupil would arrive. He would have pupils all morning, and then lunch. He would have a break and then walk back to college for his next pupil at 5 o'clock. He had pupils from 5 to 7, and then dinner. And then after dinner, it was nearly always a meeting with students, those who were reading Anglo-Saxon or something like that.
During that time, he had a very heavy teaching load. Under the Oxford tutorial system, it's very intensive. You're 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 with students, with constant work being read and marked every week. Very heavily involved in exam marking and all college business. He was also looking after a house with Mrs. Moore and her daughter. And yet, if you plot alongside that how many books he wrote and academic articles, it's quite staggering.
For many of us, writing is something we put off until we have to do it. But for Lewis, it was the opposite. Writing was the thing he was craving to do. In one way, writing itself was liberation for Lewis. He could then finally express himself. It was a thing he was called to do, born to do. He loved writing.
Among Lewis's peers, his writing had a mixed reception. The Allegory of Love, his book on literary criticism, received high praise as a scholarly study of medieval tradition. But his university colleagues reacted very differently to the problem of pain. Many of them criticized Lewis for writing about religious matters when he had no theological training, and for writing for a popular audience rather than his fellow scholars. It was the beginning of a conflict between Lewis and the intellectual establishment that would remain throughout his career in Oxford. Lewis, however, never shied away from conflict or debate.
And he didn't mind too much if the debate moved over into argument. Never bad-tempered argument. I never saw him angry at any point, but he could be vehement. He liked arguing and often didn't know his own strength when he was arguing. When sitting by him, I felt a little bit like some fledgling martial arts novice in the presence of a very aged and wily samurai who knew all the tricks and was determined to win. He liked to win his arguments.
Whenever Lewis came against someone else who wanted to argue, he loved it. But there was also this very gentle man who, when somebody had needs, was ready to give what he had, was ready to reach out.
And sometimes the person in need was one of his students.
My mother's maiden name was Mary Shelley, and she was a distant descendant of the poet, which was made much of when she won this big scholarship to Oxford in 1930. Oh, she was wild and carefree. She was an atheist. She was a terrific reader and very keen on Virginia Woolf and ideas of freedom and free love and romanticism. And she also loved George MacDonald, who was a great link with Lewis. But she impressed him, or her teachers said how wonderful she was. And he met her on Magdalen Bridge, and there was something about that meeting. She was on a horse, which persuaded him to take her on as a student. Well, she fell in love with a guy who none of us know who he was, and he was married, and she had a wild affair with him. And I mean, they went the whole hog. They went into hotels in Bloomsbury and everything. It was unheard of to have an affair at university. It was all right after you were married, perhaps, but university was outrageous. And he dumped her just before her finals. And I think that's why she failed miserably. At that time, especially as a woman, that was it. She was ruined, really. C.S. Lewis was extremely upset because she had always been considered his most brilliant student, one who would undoubtedly get a first-class degree. And in the letter he wrote to her, he said, "I don't want you to get the idea that you've got a third-class mind, because you haven't." She didn't know what to do. She decided to teach. And my mother applied for this job at senior school and asked Lewis for a reference. And he wrote her such a good reference that she got the job in preference to W.H. Auden, who had also applied. Well, C.S. Lewis was a spiritual mentor to my mother ever since they started corresponding when she was at Dartington. And he eventually persuaded her to become a Christian. She found it very hard to come to terms with Christianity because it represented all kinds of things that she couldn't stand, like stuffiness. And once she became a Christian, it did change her a lot.
Because of his demanding schedule, Lewis spent a great deal of time at Magdalen College. But his real home was the Kilns, a few miles away in the village of Headington.
Lewis bought the Kilns in 1930, along with his brother and Mrs. Moore, the mother of his dead friend, Paddy. They moved in here together, along with Mrs. Moore's daughter, Maureen, who was effectively a kind of sister figure to Lewis. She was only 8 years his junior. And they were delighted by the place. Warren and Jack in particular were delighted by the garden. They had about 8 acres of land, including a lake and woods, and a large kitchen garden and a tennis court. Not that they played tennis very much, but they did play croquet and badminton on the front lawn, and they really loved the place.
Jack and Warnie attended Sunday morning service at their parish church in Headington. It was there that an idea came to Jack which would lead to one of his most popular and enduring books.
He was sitting in his pew in Holy Trinity Church one Sunday at the Holy Communion service when he had suddenly had this idea of a Under-Secretary of Hell writing to a junior templar on earth about how to tempt the young man who's becoming a Christian. You want to stop it if you can. But if you can't stop it, then what do we do to corrupt him? And thus these wonderful Screwtape Letters. The first one was written in his head at, Holy Communion service. And when he got home, he wrote it down, and then about 30 more letters followed that in quick succession, and you got one of the most important books that he ever wrote.
The Screwtape Letters first appeared in 1941 as weekly articles in a Church of England newspaper. People who didn't belong to any church began buying the paper just to read the letters in which Screwtape always referred to God as the enemy. My dear Wormwood, never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are in a sense on the enemy's ground. I know we have won many a soul through pleasure. All the same, it is his invention, not ours. He made the pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. About the same time, Lewis was asked by BBC Radio to give a series of broadcast talks during the difficult days of the Second World War.
So they asked Lewis if he would like to talk about, give a series of 4 talks on, modern literature. He said, not that wouldn't suit me, but I will give some talks. But I think it have to be on Christianity. But I think we have to go back because people today don't realize that they are sinners. And so before they realize that, they have to have the diagnosis. Millions heard them. And I remember one of Lewis's pupils told me he was in an officer's mess. And he said the bartender had just started to pour something in a glass, and Lewis's voice was going on. And he was waiting for the drink, and the bartender was holding the bottle and the glass, but he couldn't put them together because they wanted to hear what Lewis said. So riveting was it.
Now, of course, he's already a great writer. And, anyone who's written, you have to write to a deadline, or you have to write to length, but not like the demands the BBC had. I mean, you had to hit 10 minutes on the dime. This genius of concision, of pungency, was improved by the BBC's demands on Lewis. I've heard that Lewis's was the second most recognized voice in England after Churchill's for a period of time there, and these broadcasts are the reason for that.
One of the remarkable things about Lewis was that he was a communicator who could reach out to the non-academic world. He could give very learned lectures, but he could also speak with remarkable freshness to people in other disciplines and from other walks of life. in a way that you might not have expected from a deeply learned Oxford don. And that, to my mind, is very remarkable.
And those 4 talks generated such enormous interest for the BBC. They asked him back for a second series, then a third, and then a fourth. And then those 4 series were brought together as Mere Christianity.
When school children were evacuated from London and came to live in Oxford, it brought another dimension into the life of C.S. Lewis.
He liked children much more than I think he thought that he did. And when he had evacuees during the war staying at the kilns, he got very fond of some of them.
Well, I first went to the kilns when I was, I think, about 16. It was planned that I was going to be evacuated there. And so I went up to meet Mrs. Moore and be vetted, and apparently that was all right. And so it was arranged that I would go and live with her and the family. Well, it came as a tremendous shock to discover that Jack Lewis was C.S. Lewis, whom I revered, whose books certainly the Screwtape Letters I'd read, and various other bits and pieces of his I'd read, and I think I'd heard him speak, and he was a hero. And I had no idea that this man in the house, Jack Lewis, was he. And I think I'd been there about 2 or 3 weeks when the penny dropped. I saw the books on the bookshelves and the name Lewis, and eventually I clocked it. And I was absolutely, I didn't know where to look, how to speak to him. I was so overawed, really, completely overawed. And it took me about 2 weeks before I could look him in the face again. He was so kind to me. He put up with all my infantile, he never made me feel inferior or unintelligent, or that I'd said something stupid, which of course I did all the time. Living at the kilns at the time was Jack and Minto, Mrs. Moore, and Warney, Jack's elder brother, who'd been in the army, Major Lewis, and me. And then in the garden, in a hut, Paxford's hut, there was Paxford, and Paxford had been with the family for years and years and years. Well, I had to get up very early, particularly in the summer, because Mrs. Moore was a tremendous, she was an autocrat, and things had to be done in a certain way. And her belief was that the chickens must be let out of their roosting house within half an hour sunrise. And then they had to be put to bed half an hour before dark, I think. Yes, because of foxes and things like that. So, for instance, when I went to see a play at the Playhouse in Oxford, I never saw the third act because I always had to get back to put the chickens to bed. Yes, we were an odd household, really. And one of the members of the household for a time was a boy called Ronnie, who was mentally handicapped to some degree. I don't know how much. He was probably about 22 or 23, but he couldn't read or write. And Jack used to spend, I think, 2 evenings a week with him, teaching him to read, which is very typical of him, in the sense that, without wanting to sound pious, I mean, if there was an opportunity to do good, Jack would do it. But he was also travelling all over the country at weekends, going to RAF bases and army bases, giving talks mostly about religion. But the train journeys were absolutely appalling. I mean, he would, in those days, a train would just stop if an army train had to come through. It could take you hours and hours and hours to get anywhere, and it did, and he'd come back pretty tired. And then once a week, the Inklings used to meet. That was his one evening of real relaxation.
The Inklings were a group of Christian friends who gathered round Lewis because Lewis and Tolkien liked to hear written compositions read aloud. And they met every Thursday evening in term time, and usually every Tuesday morning in the Bird and Baby Palm. And it was there that Lewis read aloud to his friends, Tolkien, Charles Williams, Major Lewis, and others. He read aloud The Problem of Pain as it was being written, the Screwtape Letters. It was there that Tolkien read The Lord of the Rings, or most of it, aloud during the time it was being written. And you can imagine what it was like. These men, this was a no-holds-barred affair. You expected to say what you thought of this work, and if they didn't like it, they said so. But at least they had good critics and honest ones as well.
In 1940, C.S. Lewis began meeting with a spiritual director, Father Walter Adams, an Anglican priest. He found the discipline of weekly confession at first daunting and then liberating. Lewis wrote to a friend, "What a mercy to have another's voice to liberate me from all the endless labyrinths of the solitary conscience."
I remember Father Walter Adams. He was a small man and he used to wear a big black cloak. My mother adored him because he was so sweet, you know. And he was the confessor for both C.S. Lewis and my mother until he died in 53, 52, something like that.
Lewis found great encouragement from Father Adams and said of him, "If ever I have met a holy man, he is one."
After Father Adams's funeral, we went to Lewis's rooms for a drink and some sandwiches, I think. And my mother and father were there, and Hugo Dyson. And Dyson and Lewis had the most amazing repartee, which was terrific fun to be part of. And it was a wonderful, wonderful time. And I always think, when I see the films and plays about C.S. Lewis, that they never portray the fun he was. He was enormous fun. He's an incredibly good conversationalist, very witty, of course, and just made you roll about with laughter. And that never came out, in my opinion. Yeah, right.
During the 1940s, C.S. Lewis went beyond his role as an Oxford tutor to become a person whose voice was known throughout Britain. In addition, his best-selling books carried his words around the world. But undergirding everything was a man who sought above all to please God through his life and his work.
It would be very hard for me to say much about Jack's spirituality, except that he was totally imbued with it. It was what he was. He didn't make any sort of show of it, but he just was a good man. And he made big sacrifices to be a Christian. The final crunch was that he had to decide whether Jesus Christ was the person that he said he was, or whether he was a charlatan or a liar or totally self-deceived. And it seemed apparent to him in the end that he must be speaking the truth, and so then he followed it.
What was noticeable was how deep it went, how all of his thoughts were transformed by Christ and by grace, and how he saw everything through this prism of Christianity.
He tried to write about what he thought God wanted him to write about. And he often talks about trying to listen for the Spirit's leading, or praying about his writing, so that he did what he was being called to do.
Early on in the 30s, in the introduction to Mere Christianity, he says early on he realized that the one thing he could do was to try to explain Christianity to people who didn't have the abilities or advantages that he had. And he stuck to that.
His joy had been fulfilled. He had found God. He knew God. And that transformed him and enabled him to be the man he was to be. So Lewis shows that unless we find God, we cannot be what we should be, and that we find that in God through Christ. And that, to me, is the most important thing.
For me, he was a saint, and always will be. Not at all what other people would think of as a saint, perhaps. I mean, a great, loud-laughing, rowdy Oxford professor, liked his beer, but he was a saint, I think.
In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis compares the result of having Christ in our lives to having salt on food. Far from killing the taste of the egg and the tripe and the cabbage, he writes, it actually brings it out. They do not show their real taste till you've added the salt. It is something like that with Christ and us. The more we get what we now call ourselves out of the way and let Him take us over, the more truly we become ourselves. In that sense, our real selves are all waiting for us in Him.